Welcome. This is Witness I. Today with us is a Professor Lisa Hajjar, sociologist from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Hello, and thank you very much for being a guest.
Thank you.
We would like to start with everything that you have studied, and you have long studied torture as a tool of state power. How does Israelis' use of torture in Gaza function within its broader colonial and genocidal project?
Well, the way in which Israel has been a torturing regime pretty much for its entire existence. And we have to, whenever you're thinking about torture, you always have to ask why. Like, what purposes does torture serve? So in an Israeli context, Israel has been in a state of war since it was established. And basically, Israel, the Zionist project, regards Palestinians, both individually and collectively, as existentially threatening. In other words, Palestinian existence, politically and materially, in the land that Israel claims for itself, it has always been treated as a security threat. So Palestinians have been securitized. Now, there was definitely always the use of torture against Palestinians inside of Israel between 1948 and 1967, but particularly after the occupation of the remainder of historic Palestine, Gaza and the West Bank in 1967. Torture was absolutely central to Israeli control strategies. And the way in which I've studied and come to understand it, especially for this kind of control, I refer to it as a trifecta, that there was torture in order to produce information that was then used for prosecution. That's the second part of the trifecta. And then the third part is conviction, and then they get sent to prison. So torture is sort of a means to a larger end, which was mass imprisonment. But because Israel regards itself as likes to fancy itself as a country that abides by the rule of law, they couldn't just throw Palestinians in prison without a trial, right? So they had to have this whole illusion of, prosecution and so-called justice in the military court system.
But
of course,
putting them in jails without a prosecution is not excluded.
That's absolutely correct. But they also use torture for that. They use torture to produce evidence that they can't use in a court, but it's secret evidence for administrative detention. So both of these things, in a sense, the objective is to incarcerate as many Palestinians as possible. Torture serves both purposes. But it would be, even if, although Israel throws Palestinians into jail, those who are administratively detained, they still argue, we've got evidence. We've imprisoned these people for a reason. It's secret, but we've got it. We know it. Therefore, so it's that distinguishes Israel from regimes that just round up people and throw them into dungeons.
Yes, and detaining kids and children at the age of 4 and 7 and 12. How do you comment that?
Mm-hmm. Well, in a sense,
how is that even being justified in the international community or international law or in a global sense? Like, how come it is being allowed it?
Well, it's not actually allowed under international law, but the phenomenon of arresting children, and children as young as 12 can be prosecuted and convicted, it's part of the dehumanization process. People who've been dehumanized aren't children. They're just junior people or little people, little terrorists as opposed to big terrorists in this kind of rhetoric. So in a sense, but then Israel, again, because the Israeli government, like the United States, lawyers labor to reinterpret the law in order to make it look as though what Israel's doing, even if it defies international law, it somehow passes a legal muster within an Israeli context.
But the way that it's actually being passed and is still passing under the eyes of the international laws and community, how is that being normalized?
Well, this is, I think,
we're kind of witnessing it's being normalized.
Right. Well, only normalized if people accept those kind of arguments. And that is, in fact, it's one of the things that I really focus on in my own work, is looking at what does international law actually say, and then what do governments like Israel, like the United States, like Britain, like Australia, in certain cases, where they reinterpret the law. They don't ignore the law. They say what the law really means is that what we are doing to our enemies is perfectly legal. But so that might be, you might call that normalization, and that's actually a good way of thinking about it. But that's not actually legal. So whenever any person who has any wherewithal at all can understand the law, and the law is not rocket science, you basically say you should talk about when Israel legalizes torture or legalizes extrajudicial execution, that we know that there's what the law says, and then there's what Israeli government lawyers say the law says. But what they say it says isn't actually true, so they're normalizing it. I mean, the same way you'd almost have to put normalization in quotation marks.
Yes, and from your point of view, is the purpose of the torture in Gaza limited to intelligence gathering, or does it also serve symbolic and psychological functions of domination?
Yes, all of those. I mean, I think it serves many purposes. But I will also say that the torture is not limited to Gaza. I mean, obviously, Palestinians from, inside of Israel, the West Bank and Gaza have always been subjected to torture. And so one of the things, if we're talking just about the period since October 7th, 2023, when Israel began, its unprecedented onslaught on Gaza, which has quickly turned into a genocide. One of the phenomena that I've actually been writing about and talking about is that Palestinians, also from the West Bank, also from Israel, were swept up in this mass, arrest. I mean, obviously, many more Gazans were swept up, but even Palestinians who were inside of prisons already, people who were serving long sentences, so they were obviously not. They were already in Israeli custody on October 7th. Part of what Israel did was wage war on prisoners that paralleled what was going on in Gaza. In the post-October 7th period, there was both the two purposes of torture, particularly of Gazans who were swept up. And it was huge, indiscriminate sweeping up of all kinds of people, was partially to try and gather information, where are the hostages held? Who's in Hamas? Are you in Hamas? Can we do things to you? And the other purpose was to literally, they already had Palestinians in custody, but they were waging the same kind of war on the bodies of Palestinians in their custody that they were waging on the people of Gaza with bombers and tanks, etc.
Yeah, in your investigation, your presentation mentioned detainment as a central site of the abuse. Could you elaborate on the role of such military bases as extra-legal zones for the exercise of unhacked violence?
Right. So, Israel has used military bases in the past to hold people that are rounded up and arrested. So, for example, during the first Intifada, which began in 1987, when, it was a mass, mostly non-violent uprising protesting the long-term occupation. And, Israel's response to that was, break their bones, break their arms. But a number of arrests in order to put down the Intifada, there was a massive increase in arrests, and so the existing prisons couldn't accommodate them, and so the military established a huge prison out in the Negev desert, Ketziot, which so they were already using the desert and having the conditions of the desert actually enhance the suffering of those who were already in Israeli custody. So after October 7th, at least 3 military bases were parts of them were repurposed to house people caught in Gaza. And so Sde was one of them, and it's closest to Gaza. And so the conditions in Sde were, Palestinians were, mostly Gazans were there. And we would analogize it to like a black site, like the CIA black sites in the War on Terror, because people went in there, they were held incommunicado. They couldn't communicate with anybody. They couldn't see a lawyer. Their names and their treatment were secret. They were basically in Israeli custody. And what was happening, as we came to learn what was happening in Sde and other places, was Palestinians were jammed into pens, basically. And they were forced to sit in uncomfortable cuffed positions for 16 hours a day. If they moved, if they talked, they could be beaten, and so they were all just sort of using the bodies themselves in a crowded conditions, putting them into painful positions, denying them decent food, water, holding them under the sun in the day or outside. I mean, the desert becomes very cold at night. And so the conditions at Sde were absolutely horrific. The way we first learned about the horrors going on in Sde and I would say Sde is not uniquely more horrible, but it was the one where we were finding out, was a doctor who was working at State Taimen in April of 2024. He wrote a letter to members of the Israeli cabinet, and the letter was published by Haaretz. And his letter warned the cabinet. He said, I'm a surgeon. I'm working at State Taimen. I've been operating, cutting off the arms or legs of Palestinians because their cuffs were on so tightly that we had to remove their legs. And so he warned the cabinet and said, what's happening here, I mean, Israel is violating even its own law, which would allow for a great deal of, abusive treatment of Palestinians. And so then you start getting a few soldiers who were working at State Taimen, playing whistleblowers. And so in May 2024, CNN did a big expose based on whistleblowers and some Palestinians who've been released. And then over time, we've gotten more information. But because, like in any sort of prison environment, the only way you can really know what's happening in the bowels of a prison, especially a prison where, the government has set it up to be, secret procedures or the identities of people are secret, is if either people are released and they talk about what happened, or people who work in the prison and they feel so guilty or disgusted by what they're doing that they, come out and play whistleblower.
The things that are also appearing and emerging under the surface is a sexual violence and gang rapes at these centers, especially at State Taimen. How do we see that in the context of international law?
Right. Well, I mean, everything, all of these things are completely categorically illegal. The question would be
still their own one.
Yeah, I mean, so in other words, like Israel is, in some ways, I mean, this kind of violence, sexual violence is, again, it's part of this, if you've dehumanized people, one of the ways in which people are most vulnerable, men and women, is when they're naked, when they're sort of like targeted, like their sexual organs or, sort of sexual threats against them, which isn't to say, it's categorically unlike being beaten or whatever, but it's a particular form of vulnerability. And Israel has utilized sexual violence and threats and actual rape of detainees for, across time. But many people, men and women who were detained in the post-October 7th period said that, sexual threats and, sexualized humiliations were absolutely common. People were, guards were like sort of inspecting their genitals and so on. But with the real, one of the outrages that we came to know about was that one Palestinian who was from Gaza, detained in State Taimen, was gang raped by 9 soldiers. And the only reason we know that is because they came in and got him, and the room where they got him from, there was a surveillance camera. And so, in fact, the whole gang rape was caught on surveillance camera, and that was what forced, the military advocate general to try and pursue charges. But then, when they were trying to pursue charges against, of all the horrors, all the torture, it was this one incident. I mean, the man who was gang raped was absolutely destroyed physically. But, why this one form of accountability when everything else was there was because of the surveillance camera. But because of the surveillance camera and the fact that they caught this gang rape, and the military advocate general wanted to prosecute 9 soldiers, right-wing Israelis were like, no, our soldiers are heroes. Nothing that they do to Palestinians should be used against them. We can do anything we want to Palestinians. So, it's the dehumanization coming full, to its farthest conclusion, where you get Israelis arguing for their right to rape.
So that means that you don't have only individual guilt tomorrow, sometime in court, but you have state responsibility in this legal battle when all of this one day comes to court. So how do we even understand that? What does this relation to these crimes suggest about state complicity and the protection of the perpetrators?
Well, I mean, in any kind of war crime or, crimes involving custodial abuses, there's, a thing called the chain of command, right? I mean, so even if a general doesn't perpetrate a war crime himself, off, if soldiers under him are perpetrating a war crime, he's responsible because of the chain of command. Similarly, one can say that whatever happens, if gross violations, torture, and other gross violations occur in prisons or detention centers, the authorities who are responsible for those prisons and detention centers also bear chain of command responsibility. But in the case of Israel, the person who was put in charge of the Israel Prison Service and the police is an extreme right-wing, person. His name is Itamar Ben-Gvir, and he's the head of the Jewish Power Party. But he was, and for that reason, Netanyahu made him the head of the Israel Prison Services in 2022, and he got this opportunity, and he said long before October 7th, and he said, now I'm going to use my power, and I'm going to really make those terrorists pay. And so they were already, in a sense, suffering. But he has been, vocally supportive of soldiers and guards abusing Palestinians in custody. I mean, he's advocated it, he's championed it. So if there's ever a day for accountability, Itamar Ben-Gvir is definitely going to be on the list of people if he travels somewhere, for example, where there's universal jurisdiction. He may never want to leave Israel again, though.
Yes, and from a sociological perspective, what does it mean when a state openly tolerates or protects or even celebrates the degradation and of its captives? How does it look like?
Well, it looks like America.
It
looks like America. One of the things you could say is that when the United States authorized a torture policy, when that policy, and I would say one can make an analogous thing, when the enemies have been so demonized. I mean, in the case of Israel, it's Palestinians. In the case of the United States after 9/11, and they didn't almost need 9/11 to be Islamophobic, but it was like this notion that the terrorists, all Arabs, all Muslims were, sort of conflated with this idea of the existential threat. So the irony was when the Abu Ghraib photos became public in April 2024, support for torture started going up. And when Barack Obama was elected, and in his first day in office, he sort of outlawed the torture program that had been instituted under the Bush administration. The support for torture went up, and it went over 50%. And until today, you still have a majority of Americans and a significant majority of right-wing Americans, Republicans, who absolutely support and advocate torture. And one can say the same thing. You could see the same kind of xenophobic, nationalistic, demonizing the other or enemy occurring in Israel. And so those are the reasons why people, when their enemies or their despised others have been so dehumanized, anything the government does to them is legitimate. And any argument that government officials put forward, we needed to do that, or we didn't really hurt them, or this isn't torture, this is just moderate physical pressure. All of those things are gobbled up by a gullible country swept in the throes of nationalistic excuses for whatever their government does.
And what are the tools to fight against that? Because that should not be as I said before, normalized. It should not be accepted as a way of life. And considering the momentum of our living space and life that we're actually in right now, what does it take us, and what are the tools to fight against that? Because eventually we do have laws, but it seems like they're pointless.
Well, I mean, one of the things you can say about the law will not enforce itself. That's one thing. And also, the law is a double-edged sword. Governments can use the law, to maintain order or to harm their enemies or whatever. But people can also utilize the law to sort of use it against the state when the state violates the law. And so in that sense, I'm a sociologist, so I really think about the law as a terrain of struggle. And one of the things that's very important on this terrain of struggle is for people, just regular folks, to familiarize themselves with some of the basic legal rules and norms are. Educators, anybody who is educating people in college, to take the opportunity to help students understand, the law is not just some specialized arcane zone. We can all understand it. And one of the things I would always say, that the value of law is not so much that it will produce justice, at least in the short term, but it gives us a lens to judge the world. We can judge what's happening in Gaza, not say, oh, that's bad, oh, that's sad. No, that's a crime. That's not just any crime. That is the crime of crimes. It is genocide. That's, abusing prisoners. So that's not just sad or, necessary. That is an illegal act. Torture is categorically illegal. Every single person on earth, under all circumstances, has a right not to be tortured. And there are no exceptions.
Yes, considering so many detainees actually die under these tortures, why is it so important, and how important it is documenting all of those crimes?
So it's absolutely important to document them. I mean, for one thing, any act of documenting, atrocities is important. It honors the people who suffered or died as a result. It also is a way of holding, at least a record that can be used in the future for accountability. And so I think that, the ways that we think about understanding, documenting, analyzing gross violations is important. And the law is our means to, that's the framework that we use in order to say what is wrong. And I think that because governments, particularly governments like, I don't know if I could say that about the Trump administration, but at least every U.S. government before Trump and Israeli governments, maybe before Netanyahu, were, they don't want to be seen as engaging in outrageous or illegal efforts. So that was why you have all these efforts to legalize things. But when you really can call Israel to task in the International Court of Justice for genocide, even all the propaganda in the world is not going to make that accusation go away. And that accusation and all of the evidence marshaled is going to live as part of the historical record.
And how can we responsibly and ethically record all those experiences of people being sexually and genderly violent, and in general, all of this violence? How can it be ethically and morally documented without offending the victims?
Well, I think this is something that many human rights organizations, the issue of how do you take testimony from people who've been sexually violated, men or women. And so I think that, people who are engaged in human rights organizations or lawyers, doing victim, support things are trained to be able to understand, you let people sort of tell their own story. You let them say what they want to say and not force them to say things that they don't want to. Some people can't face what happened to them. Other people are eager to let other people know about it. So I don't think that there's one answer. I mean, I think that the way that people respond to violence against them is going to vary according to people's personalities. But there are ways of sensitively trying to elicit this kind of information. And we've got a lot of information, the human rights organizations have elicited about, since October 7th, what's been happening in prisons and detention facilities. And they come from the people themselves, people who were released. I mean, thousands of people were released, but hundreds have been able to say, this is what I saw. This is what happened to me. This is what, people did. And when the way that you know that it's true is when people are giving testimony about what they saw or experienced, and you're getting identical testimony from people who don't know each other. I mean, that's the only way that, the prisons can cry, that the people coming out of prisons can explain, sort of give people a witness eye inside.
Yes. And, through your methodology and investigations, how do you navigate the tension between academic distance and moral urgency when dealing with testimonies of extreme violence?
Well, I have always made, personally, I always say that I only want to study things I hate. That is what motivates me. I derive satisfaction from understanding the things I hate most, writing about them, exposing them, etc. So I wouldn't necessarily say, maybe objective or not objective, but the way that I analyze what I do is I become an expert on torture. I become an expert on Israeli military courts or Guantanamo in order to basically say, what's up? Is there another side? Like Guantanamo might be good or torture might be okay. No, it's what you want to understand. You have standards and norms, and then you understand what's going on in an expert kind of a way. That's the objectivity. And anybody who sort of rebuts you on the grounds that, oh, you're hurting important interests, those are the unobjective people.
And as a contributor to the Gaza Tribunal, how do you see this initiative contributing to the global understanding of torture as a form of genocide?
Well, I think that torture is just one of the elements, but I am happy that we were able to include it as part of the proceedings. I think that the Gaza Tribunal, like other people's tribunals, they are not themselves legal proceedings, but they do take the law as the standard that they're presenting information. And the work that went in to both analyzing these different categories of like the components of the genocide, torture, domicide, like the destruction of homes, scholasticide, starvation, all of the things that go there. These are, important for several reasons. One, they are acknowledging what Palestinians in Gaza are going through. They are creating a record or contributing to a record that's already being created in many kind of ways. And the tribunal is articulating like a set of understandings about not just that this is wrong, why this is wrong, how this is wrong, and what should happen as a result of this wrongness, which is accountability.
Yeah, what are from your point of view, are the limits of existing legal mechanisms like CAT or the ICC in addressing these atrocities? Can tribunals like this fill those gaps?
Tribunals like this can't field the gaps of legal systems because they don't have any enforcement power. These are more like moral and educational things. But the kind of information, the work that this tribunal and other tribunals do, the work that human rights organizations do when they're producing reports is to basically put information into the public sphere that can actually get people to both understand and be appalled by what's happening. And so for actual accountability, I mean, I'm very, happy that South Africa brought this case in the International Court of Justice. What we're seeing happening, I mean, it'll take years for the case to go through. So what the ICJ is doing is kind of like what the tribunal is doing. It's going to produce a record. I mean, it'll be more authoritative because it's a legal institution. But part of what the tribunal and other things do is there's a form of criminal accountability doctrine called universal jurisdiction. And what universal jurisdiction means is that any government in the world can prosecute anybody from anywhere in the world for the 4 gross crimes: torture, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. They don't have to have a relationship to the crime or the perpetrator or whatever. If there's a reason to prosecute people. And so I think that getting information into the public domain is particularly important to galvanize countries where their legal systems may be inclined to pursue individual perpetrators. Spain, Brazil was trying to go after people. You have different countries in Europe, and this notion of universal jurisdiction, I think, is the most promising because it's not dictated by the international order, which is dominated by the United States and sort of, countries that are looking after their own foreign policy before legal standards.
And finally, what's the responsibility of scholars, journalists, academics, all those people who study what's happening currently? What does it have in the process of confronting the normalization of torturing people and erasure of Palestinian sufferings and everything that is happening in Palestine right now?
Right. Well, I think that, academics and journalists and, novelists, everybody who produces knowledge in some form or another is contributing because, among all the other things that, the conflict is and all the suffering Palestinians have, it's also, in addition to everything else, a battle for narratives. It's a battle for narratives. What is true? What can be known? How do we assess, the suffering? How do we assess the causes of the suffering? All of those things contribute to the narrative terrain, and that is absolutely integral to the larger conflict.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for Witness Eye. Till next time.